Leaving the square, the wild geese flew forward along the coastline. Neil and Martin saw the sea for the first time and danced with excitement. The endless sea surface is glowing with gleaming light, and the white waves rush towards the shore, tumbling, whistling, and then retreating. Black rocks stood on the sea, a long and narrow bay meandered, and the curved coastline stretched into the distance. Neil looked left and right, his head swaying like a rattle. In this way, they flew for a whole day. At this moment, a pleasant south wind blew. Neil and Martin were intoxicated in the warm wind, humming happily. But Oscar nervously and frightenedly patrolled the sky and sea, urging the geese to fly quickly. The vast sea suddenly turned black, and the wind roared, getting stronger and stronger. "Follow me, hurry up," Oscar ordered. She spread her wings and led the geese down, but the geese were sucked into the violent whirlwind and turned violently. The waves roared and crashed into each other. The sky turned pitch black. Dark clouds flew low over the sea, and the geese were trapped in the middle and struggled with the strong wind. Oscar ordered everyone to lower themselves to the water to avoid being blown away by the wind. By the time they struggled to land, Neil was already soaked by the waves. The cold waves hit him over and over again, making him shiver with cold and almost fall into the sea. Janice and Martin were close to each other, unwilling to separate for a moment. The geese were a little dizzy with the bumps of the waves, and gradually began to take a nap. They stretched their necks under their wings to take a break. But the wise Oscar shouted loudly, "Wake up! You can't sleep! Anyone who sleeps will be washed away by the waves." After hearing this, everyone tried their best to cheer up, but within a minute, they fell asleep again. Soon, Oscar couldn't hold it any longer and fell asleep. Suddenly, a huge, round black head poked out next to Oscar. "Seal! Seal! Seal!" Oscar screamed, flapping his wings and flying up. The sleepy geese woke up immediately and reluctantly flew up. Some of them were so soundly asleep that they didn't move. Oscar flew over and pecked them awake with his mouth. They were almost caught by the greedy seal. The wild geese took to the air again, and the storm once more scattered them. As dusk came, the wild geese were struggling above the dark sea. Their strength had been exhausted. Even if 10 more seals came, they would not be able to fly. At this moment, Oscar shouted excitedly, "Island! Island! There is an island in front of us!" The storm gradually subsided, and the wild geese cheered up and rushed towards the island hard. As soon as they threw themselves on the shore, they fell asleep. Neil didn't have time to crawl under Martin's wings and fell asleep with his arms around his neck. Neil had a strange dream. In the dream, while he was sleeping, 4 big black cats blew air around him, blowing the bed up and down. Neil held onto the mattress tightly, but he was still thrown down. Neil woke up in fright. When he opened his eyes, the black cats were gone. He found himself lying on a cold rock, with Martin and the geese sleeping peacefully beside him. The white moon hung in the sky, and the surroundings were extremely quiet. Neil couldn't sleep anymore, so he wandered around the island. In order to kill time, Neil climbed up to a tree trunk that fell on the seaside and threw the small stones he picked up against the water. The stones seemed to be dancing and sank into the sea after a few bounces. The moon is reflected on the sea. It would be fun if the stone could jump to the moon, Neil thought, but that requires very flat stones. Neil remembered that the crow had given him 2 gold coins, and he still had one in his pocket. It would be a good idea to use it instead. So he took out the gold coins from his pocket. Nils held the gold coin and leaned forward to throw it to the sea, but the gold coin was too heavy, and Nils lost his grip. With a dang sound, the gold coin fell to the ground and rolled down the sloping beach. Nils hurriedly went to pick it up. The gold coin rolled to the water's edge and started spinning. After a while, it fell motionless on the wet beach. Neil bent down and was about to reach out to pick it up. Suddenly, the The ground shook violently, and he fell to the ground, supporting himself with his hands. At this time, a huge wave surged on the coast, and the sea surface churned violently. A pointed tower top slowly emerged from the water, and then a bustling city emerged from the water. In front of Neil was a strong and tall city wall that almost covered half of the sky. At the top of the city wall were battlements arranged neatly like teeth. Several sentries standing guard wore golden helmets and walked around the battlements with spears in their hands. Neil couldn't believe it and pinched his ear hard. The pain made him say, "Oops," and he was not dreaming. There is a gate in the middle of the city wall. The two gates were closed tightly. As soon as Neil approached them, the rusty door knocker suddenly squeaked, and the two city gates slowly opened with a beep sound. Inside the city gate is a large square, with streets extending in all directions from around the square. The streets were filled with colorful flags and all kinds of bright lights. The men wore velvet robes and feathered hats. The women wore embroidered clothes, with 5-color ribbons fluttering on their heads like many beautiful butterflies. Neil thought, there should be a festival here, but why is no one singing and dancing? The expressions on people's faces were sad and alarmed, and they looked up uneasily. Neil followed people's gaze and looked over. A square clock tower stood in the center of the square. "There is also a big clock here. Let me play here for an hour," Neil said. Neil walked into a street, and there was a beautifully dressed woman sitting in front of every house. They sighed, and silently spun the golden yarn on their spinning wheels, looking at the big clock from time to time. They were probably tired, so they looked at the clock to see if it was time for rest, Neil thought, as he turned into another street. The street is filled with the sound of ding-dong-dong banging. Masters in the weapons factory are making broadswords and swords. From time to time they stop to wipe their sweat and secretly glance at the big clock. In other streets, shoemakers are sewing boots. Women workers are weaving lace cloth, and jewelers are polishing colorful gemstones. Everyone was working silently, but they would look up at the clock from time to time. There are densely packed shops on both sides of a wide street. The shop doors are open, and the shelves are filled with goods, but the business is very deserted. The clerks all sat dejectedly, and the customers in the store just asked about the price and left without buying anything. Neil stopped in front of a weapons shop. The shop is filled with brand new weapons, including swords inlaid with gold and silver, sharp daggers, and shields carved with lions or 7-headed dragons. In the corner, sharp spears stood like a forest, and knights' armors were stacked like hills. Neil wanted to touch the weapons that glowed white so much, so he sneaked in. There was a bearded businessman sitting at the counter. He was looking at the big clock outside the window attentively. Neil walked slowly along the wall and was suddenly attracted by a short sword. The sword is longer than Neil, and the scabbard is inlaid with jet black velvet. On the velvet, there is a silver snake with shining scales. It is tightly wrapped around the scabbard, and 2 sparkling emeralds are set on it. Neil couldn't help but stepped forward, grabbed the hilt of the sword with both hands and pulled back. Suddenly his hand shook, and there was a bang sound, and the sword fell to the ground. The businessman heard the noise and came over immediately. Neil turned pale with fright, but the merchant looked kind and smiled at him, picked up the dagger and muttered something. Then the merchant put on his helmet, took his sword and shield, and waved them in front of Neil, making a clang sound in the shop. The moonlight filtered in, shining and beating on the sword. People from other shops came one after another, bringing colorful brocades, beautiful carpets, and sparkling gems. They piled the goods next to Neil, looked at the big clock anxiously, and ran back to get more beautiful goods. Why were they in such a hurry? Why were they all looking at the clock? Neil thought. He himself couldn't help but look at the clock. From the time he entered the city to now, the big clock had almost turned a complete circle. I should go back. Otherwise Martin will look for me everywhere when he wakes up, Neil thought. So he said to the businessmen, "It's time for me to go back." But the businessmen didn't understand at all. Nils saw the bearded businessman take out a small coin from the box and point to the things everyone brought, as if to say, "For a small coin, these good things will be yours." Neil touched his pocket doubtfully. "Oops, the gold coin is still on the beach. Wait for me for a minute. I'll be right back." With that said, Nils rushed out a large pile of goods and ran out of the city gate. Neil found the gold coin in the same place. At this time, he heard the dull bell ringing from the city gate. He was about to run back when he suddenly found that the city gate was gone. The whole city seemed to have never existed and disappeared. Just when Neil was confused, the calls of Martin and the wild geese came from behind. Neil returned to the wild geese and talked enthusiastically about the strange thing he had just encountered. Everyone laughed at him, and Martin even said disdainfully that he was still dreaming. At this time, only Oscar was listening attentively. After Neil finished speaking, Oscar began to tell stories about the city. 1,000 years ago, there was a prosperous and beautiful city on the island called Vieta. The craftsmen in the city are the best in the world. Every day, the docks were filled with purchased goods, and gradually, people became very rich. They began to worry that their wealth would be appropriated by outsiders, so they took strict precautions. They sank passing ships, killed unknown customers, and even drove away seabirds. Since then, the sea in this area has become deserted. King of Seas got angry and ordered the waves to attack the city, so the residents of the city built walls to prevent the waves. The waves rose higher and higher, and the walls were built higher, but in the end, the raging tide still flooded the streets, houses, and squares. But the residents of Vieta still work day and night underwater. Their warehouses and shops are as full of goods as before, but they can no longer do business with anyone. King of Seas stipulates that the city can only float from the bottom of the sea once in 100 years, and can only stay for an hour at a time. During this period, if outsiders enter the city, no matter what they buy, the city can stay on the coast forever. If the long needle goes full circle without selling anything, the city will sink back to the bottom of the sea and wait another 100 years. "It's incredible," Neil exclaimed. "If I had brought that gold coin, I could have bought a lot of good things, and the city of Vieta could have stayed on the coast forever." Oscar said, "Okay, the story is over. It's time for us to set off." Neil looked at the calm sea with regret and rowed on Martin back.